Thank you. I now recognize myself for questions and a few comments. You know, one of the things with COVID itself that makes it very difficult is there's so many people that got COVID and didn't even know they had it. And so if you're trying to say that it was safer to have the vaccine as opposed to getting COVID, it's very difficult because many patients got COVID and didn't know. I didn't know until I couldn't smell garlic salt. So I just think we have to keep that in mind when we have a frank discussion about the benefits and risks of getting COVID at a certain age, getting COVID with certain comorbidities. All those things have to be discussed. But we can't ignore the fact that many people got COVID and didn't even know it. So that's one thing. But Dr. Maldonado, do you think it's important to have a frank discussion with patients, or in your case, the parents of children, to discuss the benefits and risks of virtually any medication, but especially vaccines?
Absolutely. I believe that the bond between a physician and a parent and a patient is sacred and really should be a transparent discussion.
And I think that's one of the things that we missed when we started putting out mandates. You eliminated the physician, and that's what a lot of people struggled with, which has, in my opinion, has led to many people having vaccine hesitancy. And when I say my opinion, it's because we're out with our constituents all the time, and we get their opinion. And so that's a difference between, say, just working in a lab or in an agency. You know, we're actually out with the people and understand what's going through their minds. You know, during part one, I asked our government witnesses to acknowledge that they were a little too general in their assertions that the vaccine was safe and effective. I said at the time, to the American public, many of them heard 100% safe and effective. That's what they interpreted that to be, but they never qualified their statement. You know, like any drug you see on TV, they say, talk to your doctor. That wasn't happening. You had the government saying safe and effective, no qualifier, not talk to your doctor. And so from what I understand, the FDA standard of safe and effective is actually very specifically defined. So Dr. Gortler, if you can very quickly, let me know, does the FDA have different standards for EUA and full BLA approval? Could you explain the difference if there is one?
Oh, sure. And Dr. Wenstrup, I appreciate the question. I'd also like to point out that one of my colleagues, Dr. David Wiseman, pointed out to me yesterday that the language, the approval language in Europe is actually a little bit different. Where it says safe and effective, I think they precursor those words with maybe safe and effective.
So what about ours?
So with ours, I believe the way the approval process works is once it's, EUA, or once it's authorized one way or another, it's authorized. The question is, though, is that, we heard like Operation Warp Speed, and, Operation Warp Speed, while it was a kind of a, a cool idea with underlying themes of, the person who conceptualized it with Yale and ham radio and Star Trek, of course. I would have just liked to have seen something a little bit simpler. Per my opening statement, maybe I'm a little bit of a Luddite, a Philistine, perhaps, but I would be interested in seeing what else is what already exists in our toolbox that isn't quite as complicated. And for instance, just to let you know, the molecular weight of ivermectin is about the same, of hydroxychloroquine, is about the same molecular weight size as Tylenol, about 300 Daltons. In contrast to that, we don't know what the exact structure is, or the exact molecular weight is for the spike protein encoding for RNA. And we also don't know, but just the spike protein alone is like 4,000 bases, which is about 200,000 Daltons compared to about 300 Daltons. So it may have been an unnecessarily, it seems like I would have liked to have seen an Operation Warp Speed for things like ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, vitamin D, maybe colchicine, bumethidine, metformin.
Well, let me get to a different question, or maybe get more specific. Are the systems that we have in place, in your opinion, adequate in ensuring the safety of COVID-19 vaccines?
The question's for me, sir?
Yes.
No, they aren't, and I can explain why. I don't think the collection systems are adequate for the following reasons. As a physician, you'll know, and there's other physicians in here, a normal physician visit is usually billed out as a code, not ICD-10, but whatever the code is. It's a 99213 for a 15-minute. A CPT code, thank you, is a 99213. In a 99213 pays a physician something like $75 for to be able to, interview, assess, diagnose, and prescribe. And if a patient were to report an adverse event during one of those events, a physician wouldn't really have the time to collect it and go on the phone and spend an hour with the FDA MedWatch system. Likewise, a pharmacist is also someone who receives quite a bit of safety complaints. But a poor pharmacist, working behind the counter at one of these grueling chain pharmacies, they have metrics by their employer, and their metrics are to hammer as many round pegs in a round hole as fast as they can, and there's no protocol, there's no way to reimburse for them to be able to report adverse events. And so because of that, there was a study funded by the AHRQ that came through out of Pfizer, or out of Harvard, that found that it's only the very, very low digits, the single, like 1%, the very, very low single digits of adverse events ever reported to VAERS. And I think there needs to be a better collection method. There needs to be more vigilance about reporting by healthcare professionals. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. And yeah, we also have concerns of reported versus verified significant event, et cetera. And that's the type of stuff we want to be better at. Dr. Whalen, do you believe that it's appropriate to house all of the potential updates and corrections to VAERS on a non-public database?
I think that there is a lot of trust involved in the medical community, but also for the general public, that something is happening behind the scenes when you can't see it right out in front. And I think, too, that people were very aware that you didn't have the kind of follow-up on vaccination generally that we expect, for instance, from our pediatricians, where you got a nurse who's going to call the following week and make sure that your child is doing okay. And I mean, my own strong feeling is that we really needed a much more proactive surveillance mechanism. And I think that many of us understand that the FDA was under enormous pressure, and also that it was an overwhelming task. And just judging by the number of VAERS reports that there have been, and knowing how challenging it can be to actually file a VAERS report, the task could have been even vastly larger than the large task that it already is. So, I mean, you have to have some level, I think, of internal dialogue that takes place. But I think ultimately, as you alluded earlier, you have to be able to create some level of trust among people, and I think the system currently does not cultivate that.
Yeah, look, there's no doubt it's a challenge. When you might have 10 adverse events from vaccines in a year, and then all of a sudden you have a pandemic and a new vaccine, and the numbers are huge. How do we prepare for that? And those are some of the things that we want to discuss here. I will say that, Dr. Whalen, the government witnesses in our part one of this told us that all serious reports to VAERS are followed up upon. There's not a timeline on that statement. But do you believe that the government is adequately following up on all serious reports to VAERS, and what might we do to improve on that?
I don't have any high level view of how often and how closely they follow up, but in my own anecdotal experience, there was not a sense of urgency. Because I was a co-author on this paper, I had an opportunity to speak directly with Dr. Marks, who spoke at your previous hearing, and they were in the process of sort of critiquing our work, and I mentioned that I had this patient who died. The whole tenor of the discussion completely changed. But even then, it was a whole month before I was able to speak with somebody, and I've never received any follow-up about it later. I'm not sure that they ever obtained the records on that particular case. So we were kind of left with the sense that if there was follow-up, they didn't do much in the way of follow-through afterwards.
Thank you. Just a quick question for Ms. Gentry, because I think in your opening statement you made many good points in your concerns for the compensation systems in place. And can you give us some idea how we should change how our system works currently?
The VICP specifically?
Well, we can start with that, yeah.
Start with that. Sure. I think certainly the main thing with the VICP that we've seen is that it just needs to be modernized. I mean, this was originally the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, and as we all know, adults routinely get vaccines now, and they've always been covered, but it needs to be expanded. Certainly, when I say infrastructure, we need to have an increase in special masters, to be sure. HHS and the Department of Justice that represents the Secretary in these cases needs to have adequate compensation, or adequate funding rather, to make sure that they can do that. We see long delays at HHS in processing petitions because they have so few reviewers to do that. And they were also deployed during COVID away from it. So I think there's certainly some delays in that. That needs to be updated. We're still looking at compensation from the 1980s for these cases. So you're looking at a death case being capped at $250,000 in the VICP. There's some additional other compensation. Pain and suffering is capped at $250,000. There are thankfully no caps on economic damages in the VICP, which is great. Future care for people with those rare individuals with serious injuries have additional care, lifelong life care plans that can come into effect. That's critical. From the standpoint of the countermeasures program, in looking at the history of the countermeasures program, I think it's always, when you don't hear much about it, it usually means it's doing fairly well. And when it starts to have an issue is when you start to hear about it. And I think the first big hit that it took was with the H1N1 vaccine back in 2009. And those cases went into the countermeasures program. That was a big chunk of cases, but nowhere near what we're seeing with COVID. And that vaccine came over because it was formulated, it was included in the formulation for the seasonal flu vaccine. The COVID vaccine, though, I just think it's not the appropriate program for it. We saw Mr. Grimes speak, Commander Grimes speak at your last hearing, and he gave the burden of proof in the countermeasures program. The burden of proof in the countermeasures program is higher than in our program, and you don't have attorneys or experts or anything like that. So I think that's a really difficult burden to meet. And when I speak of causation, I appreciated in your last hearing that both you and Ranking Member Ruiz talked about words matter. So I want to be clear with my words. When I speak of causation in these cases, I'm talking about legal causation in the vaccine court, not medical certainty, not a causal analysis, as Dr. Maldonado spoke of. We will never have epidemiology in support of our cases because they're rare events. That's what you want them to be, as rare events. But so when I speak of legal causation, it's still much harder in legal causation to prove causation in the countermeasures program than in the vaccine program, than the VICP. I try to use the vaccine program and countermeasures to a little less alphabet soup. But that's very difficult. And when you don't have right to counsel, it's incredibly difficult to prove, particularly if you're dealing with, if you're injured or you're sick or your family member's sick, to do that. So I think there's no improvement that can be made to the countermeasures program that would make it appropriate for COVID-19 vaccine cases. There are improvements that could certainly be made to the countermeasures program for everything else. Statute of limitations can certainly be increased and different things like that on compensation. But that's would be my recommendations for those improvements.
Appreciate that.